watershed supply and demand curves. And he has also developed, and this is on the website, a sort of a delta-wide version of that, but looking at water supply and water demand. And that's because through these options, we're looking at the delta-wide needs. It would be the delta-wide water supply and demand curves that we would be looking at, and that's when Diane says that it appears that there would not be any post-1914 water available in the system. It's looking at the supply and the demand for the watershed as a whole. So there's two curves, and I don't believe yesterday Mr. O'Hagan presented the delta-wide curves. He just presented the tributary curves.
So maybe, can I just maybe add some clarification? You're absolutely correct, Board Member Diadamo, that we are continuing to look at in many of the regions of the state, kind of the tributary approach that you're most familiar with, that we are all most familiar with. So we talked about the Russian yesterday. We talked about some other reaches as well. But what we wanted to do with the workshop today, because of the emphasis on the Delta, the continuing concern about the senior right holders, and all the other pieces that have come together in the presentations this morning, is we wanted to have an opportunity to talk about some options focusing on the broader Delta watershed itself that would treat it as a watershed, and various approaches and options for addressing that. So you're very correct that the traditional curves that we've been showing you for the various tributaries around the state are the path that we're continuing to head on now. But for the Delta watershed, we're coming forward today in this workshop with some approaches to look at it in a very broad way. Janine just put up on the screen behind you the curves that we have had on the website for some time now that look at the watershed as a whole, unless I don't know if you want to maybe explain what's up there.
Sure, and these, before I explain this, I'd like to just kind of bring us back to, some of the other things that we discussed today, because it's a very important concept. When you saw the curves that John was presenting showing that depletions are now going up, we've crossed this, we're making releases from storage, reservoirs have turned over, releasing more water than is being stored. All of this happens quite quickly, and we have very rapidly increasing curves starting around May or now.
Right.
When we've been providing these curves, we've been on the cusp, and we've been showing with more precision in various watersheds how have conditions been changing, because we contemplated targeted curtailments just within watersheds, especially before we got those rains. It's like, what exactly is going on in each of these watersheds? But this has always been, we've had this on our webpage for some time. This is looking at the Sacramento-San Joaquin,
Right.
And this is the supply and demand curve. And as you can see on it there, I'll use my finger pointer here. You can see that all of the post-14 demand lines have crossed the supply curves, looking at April, May. The riparian and pre-14 are crossing them into May. So that basically, that's the support for curtailment of all post-14 water right holders. So that's something that happens, and you can see all of these lines, the demand curves go up quite quickly. So that might be some of the confusion in that we've been looking at specific tributaries, but now things get dry so fast, there's so little natural flow in the system that now it's more applicable, more widely applicable to the entire watershed.
Right. Let me try a more, I don't know if it's a more pointed question, but something I know we'll hear at some point in the public comment, and this may help. Can you identify what, if there are any, and if so, what they would be, any anomalous, maybe not the right word, impacts? So the question some might raise is, particularly on the Sacramento, because there's more water in the Sacramento, but maybe there isn't a lot more natural flow in the Sacramento, that curtailing someone in the Sacramento at the same time as you curtail them in the San Joaquin somehow isn't fair, and that curtailing someone in the Sacramento isn't going to help a more senior person in the San Joaquin. But what you're saying is there's just not any water in either. for post-14,
In general, I think
regardless?
I think that's a great question, but what to not lose sight of, and what we have that makes the calculation more simple, is we have very large demand in the delta itself. So that's at the downstream end of both the Sacramento and San Joaquin. So long as that demand is up there, that would be supportive of curtailment in both watersheds. But it's worth a look, if you will, to look at the detailed watershed, say, well, let's just make sure we're not looking at the entire demand of the basin and now somehow distributing it and applying it to the entire basin, because maybe that's not all, maybe that shouldn't be curtailing the San Joaquin. That's why it's important to look at each of the curves in each of the basins to make sure, do these all align? So we're not curtailing someone in the San Joaquin when really the demand is all in the Sacramento, or vice versa. So, but what we're seeing in all of these curves now, well, there's no water for post-14 water right holders under any of these watersheds. And
So it's more likely that those anomalous things would happen when you're comparing pre-14s or riparians along the system.
yes, or earlier in the season.
Or
Earlier in
had
the
it
season
been
when-
earlier in
when
the season.
conditions are changing.
Right. That's actually helpful.
So I'd like to address another, I think, area of confusion. All of the options, like why do we have options if they're all the same? Well, as Diane was saying, some of these become dissimilar as we come out of the curtailment season into the fall. That's because we've waited quite so long. We've crossed the curves some time ago, so that if you add, and again, if you recall, it's hard without the numbers, but imagine, if you will, the rapidly increasing depletions, much in excess, the 10,000, 15,000 CFS of total going up in the summer months. Delta outflow is only now 3,000 CFS. For that curve that's shooting up, we're above that curve already. So it doesn't matter if you do option 3 or 4. You're curtailed under either option. It matters when we come back down, when you would come out of curtailment.
And then the impact then would be that time of the year on remaining storage for the uses for next year, or are you still in the temperature control phase if it starts raining in October?
It could be a little bit of both.
All right. So it still is a little bit of the burden shifting, or, as you said, what's fair under what it is we should be doing in terms of who should contribute, right? That's what you're asking us to choose then, not, because you push back on me saying who
wouldn't
bears
say
the risk if
fair.
we're wrong.
I would say, what are your goals? Do we need to be protecting? The fairness argument, I think we can be had, and we've gotten that in many comment letters in an adjudicative proceeding to sign long-term responsibility. In this year, where there's great concerns about maintaining storage conditions, what's needed?
Kind of for the greater
more
good.
needed to assure that we maintain control of the salinity in the delta, and that we can provide some cold water for endangered fish species, and that we have adequate water supplies moving into next year to meet health and safety needs? That's really, you'll get more storage water through option 3 than you do through the other options. It's really kind of this distinction to me. Whether it's fair overall for others, for parties to illegally divert stored water, probably not. I mean, that seems like an easier answer than the who should be assigned responsibility for meeting delta outflow question.
Interesting. Other questions?
On this graph, one thing I try to visualize is the delta outflow component of all this. Is it viewed calculated within the demand curves? No, and it's sort of floating out there. Yeah, could you?
No, delta outflow is not included in the demand curves.
Yeah, and then
So it would be an additional, per se demand for water. It would depend on where you would put it. Right now, it's being met through storage releases, so that would
So
be
it bumps up these. If you just incorporate it into demand, it would just bump the curves up, and maybe 20%, 10%. It would just. Okay, and then one thing I would like to point out on this graph is that the intersection of the demand lines with the supply lines are in mid-April, and yet curtailments haven't been issued in late May.
And sorry to make you crane your necks if you want to look at a pointer here, but just to look at a precise point, if you look at, where you'd start touching on the riparian and 14 demand, that's getting it to here. So, for all of the post-14 demand, we're looking about, the beginning of May. But an important point here, though, the units here are in, acre feet. Because this is rising so quickly, it's a relatively small piece. If you were to put the delta outflow component here, it would just bump up the demand just a little bit at the bottom, resulting in a little bit earlier.
Right,
But that's
because
what
the
I was
flows
referring
have
to
been
earlier.
slashed.
We're already past that intersection either way.
Right. And also,
Right.
if you look at the TUCP, the temporary change order, the delta outflow requirements have been reduced relative to, and so that's been
Substantial.
reduced substantially and built into this.
That's correct, although the biggest changes are behind us. Now we're closer to what the regular requirements would be.
All right. Now, I'm certain there could be more clarifying questions, but I'm mindful of the fact that there are a lot of people out there and that they will illuminate other issues. But this has been very helpful, I think, to me, hopefully to many others. But I have a procedural question to ask about 12 versus 13, moving into going back to 12 or going to 13. I know that the NOAA folks on this panel had to leave. Hopefully someone will come back later. I was hoping that we would ask some of the fish agency folks from 12 back, but I don't see them. It could just be that I can't see.
I don't know that they're here. I could check to see to get them back if we
I
know
would
what
kind of
time.
like to have them back for the 12 conversation, unless you all think you can handle the answers to the questions I have.
I agree with you. I think we could have them back.
Do we know a time that I could try to get them back?
You guys
for-
can pick one in the afternoon, if that's okay, unless there's an objection.
I think we'd like to pick it early enough such that we're prepared to describe for you some suggested modifications based on the conversation from yesterday, and we'd like any further feedback that you have or direction regarding whether those changes address your concerns, and if there are additional changes that you want to see us make, so that we can get to those by the end of the day.
So what makes sense? If we do it at 2, does that give you enough time, or would you rather, again, the logistics are more in your...
I guess I would need to ask.
Yeah, I was just writing an email, and I'll make a call to check to see what time. But 2 o'clock would provide time, for them to respond and get here. I don't know right now.
I'd like that. I just have some questions for them.
So
too.
why don't we do this? We will get in touch with the fish agencies. We can proceed with item 13, continue on, and we will let you know what we hear back in terms of timing. I would like, if possible, the sooner we can get back to 12, I think the easier it will be for everyone to have an opportunity to really be able to discuss potential changes and any additional direction that you might have, and give us an opportunity to get to that today.
Well, hopefully, maybe if we can find out before the lunch break, we could set it closer to 1 o'clock. We will take a lunch break, certainly between noon and 1. I don't know if we're going to want to, I have to leave just a few minutes before, so you all can decide, because we'll be hearing from the august public commenters we have here. I don't want to miss anything, but people can take notes for me of a few minutes of missing it, because I think we're going to, much will be illuminated, at least for me, as I hear what key issues some of the experts out in the audience have to say about 13, and then we'll come back and have a conversation about 12. I think I have more distilled questions from being able to sleep on it than I would have had at the end of the day yesterday.
Question?
Yeah, sure.
Is it possible to perhaps hear from the staff before the lunch break the changes they're proposing, so that we can have some time to think about them over the lunch break? How long would you need in terms of time to describe your proposed changes?
I think we could just, if we're not responding to questions also, I think we can go through it quite quickly, 15 minutes or so. I mean, it should be
I would
adequate.
like to hear it so that I have some time to think about
So
it.
would you rather just go and do that, since everybody's sitting here, and we can pull some up and then go to the public comment on 13?
Sure.
But it probably makes more sense than starting and stopping and assuming we'll only need 15 minutes, I'm fine with that. I just don't want to close on recommendations to you or have a full discussion until I ask them some questions.
I agree, but I also want to hear what staff
Yeah,
has
no,
to
that's
propose.
fine. I actually do think that a little break to think about things is useful on these matters, so. Do you want to, let's just take, if it's possible, I know it's hard to do less than 10 minutes, why don't we just take a 7 or 8 minute break so folks can align, and then we'll,
So we'll bring
because you
the
need to have
staff-
a bio break in the
We'll bring the
mid-afternoon.
staff up for item 12.
Mid-morning.
We will be prepared when we return from the break to walk through suggested
suggestions.
changes
Okay.
based on yesterday's
What you heard.
conversation.
Okay. Okay.
Where would the cold water pool be? There would be no cold water. My understanding of no, let's get to May. Let's create an emergency. Because the bottom line is, unlike what the law requires, which is balancing for public trust, there is no balancing. There is a presumption given. Fish can only be first. Everyone else is second. In the 30 years of the trial, that's not what should happen. There should be a balance between fishery. I mean, just to me. Doesn't it?
That's pretty good, they tell me when it happens. And as soon as, until it does happen, they're not going to work. Our guys are all pretty good. They can notice so much when it doesn't happen. And now, we use the keywords of reschedule the work. And then we took it out to the Bureau of Finance. Okay? So waiting. And said, this is reschedule delivery 2013.
See Mariana's head goes. Where's David?
She's out in the hallway. San Joaquin. Oh, I don't care.
She's in the hallway. You want it? She and Diane were. Okay, I'll go get her.
Underwater. And Drew doesn't want to do a coffee. He doesn't want to dump the rock and everything. So he said, I would prefer a bladder as well. And Ted called some people I know, and they, oh, those bladder guns are complicated. We should do a different type of work. So I don't know what they're going to do. Infiltration gallery is one option. And I said, fine. Yeah, that's right. Great. Good. If you got a pond over here and a river over here. Yeah. A pond here. And a lake down here. Yeah. So how that works, I don't know. I just. First thing is they told her we're going to hold back 33.
Do you want me to go find?
Why? I mean, it's not going to be enough to save the day next year. Right. So, well, why are you holding, where did this come from? Second thing is they're gonna shut down the entire main canal for 2 weeks to do repairs. And we said, critical repairs, stuff we really need to do. Okay, we'll fail this year, well, no, but, you know, this is a perfect year to do it. It's like, yeah, I couldn't think of a better year to shut down the main canal than this year. And so California, has come into this, and come to these drought meetings, and they're planning to shut down the Columbia to supply the air attack base. So, yeah, I guess they got some money in California's budget.
That much money, that's pretty easy.
I don't think.
Water hoses, drop the pump.
Yeah, they
And I got a really Alpha has pretty good pump right now.
think. I mean, I've seen them lift water up canons over 1,000 feet.
Oh, yeah.
So,
They've got the capacity.
anyway,
I say give me 10 days to break the helicopter.
we could get those, you can get those airplanes from Canada where they just skim across the lake. Scoop it. A couple of water skiers. So, are you and Tom going to read from scripture in the Untitled Chapter?
That will.
I have yet to talk to anybody, even in, I called one of the chiefs in the Congress. I said, well, which one of the options? We don't want any. That's the part they're off. And I said, well, who were you guys on this one? What? You must be doing something wrong. But they said, he's in the water system. And this is the wrong way to do it. They're not doing the proper proceeding. They're not following the law. This is all screwed up because they're concerned. They told me, I said, if they get away with this, here, watch what they do with PVC people. Well, yeah, I got a sneaking hunch. This is how this year's market's about saying. You guys
Okay,
gonna
I
go up
copied
to
them on it. I
Folsom?
copied them on
Gonna be there, or is Kim?
Hello, Kim.
When is it?
I think it's 28th, I think.
Maybe it's 28th. I think I can be there. Not sure that I respond.
No, it's 29th. 29th at 10:30.
I've got recommendation, 10:30? Yeah. Yeah, I got it on my,
Okay.
I got it on my schedule, so yeah.
we covered schedule. Sorry for the musical chairs again.
No, that's good. All right. Just to be clear for people who are listening and in the audience, we're reconvening and we're going to go to item 12 from yesterday with clarifications from staff or proposed changes that we'll be going through and then asking some of our questions, but we will not be completing this item until the afternoon in the hopes that some of the fish agency folks can come back and also answer our questions. So forgive us from bouncing back and forth. Also, and I want to look to my colleagues on this, on something different in scheduling that I talked about. I had said we would have a 12 to 1 lunch break, but there's so much stuff on the agenda that a couple of my colleagues have asked that we either, I don't know, it's up to you, either go to 12:30 and then just break for a half hour, or break from 12 to 12:30. You guys decide. That means that I will miss some of the public comment, but they have sworn they will take detailed notes for me, and we'll take a little break when I get here, because I really don't want to make a decision without knowing and listening to the public comment on this stuff. Do you have a preference between the 12 to 12:30 versus the 12:30 to 1, just so if people have appointments, they have a chance to plan?
Assuming that the staff's proposed changes won't take too long, we can break earlier and resume back earlier.
Is that okay with you? Okay.
That's fine. And I assume, and Tam, you will be leaving about 3:30. Is that correct? Okay.
Right, so we're splitting the difference there. Okay. Hi,
Good morning.
we're back.
We're
Item
back
12, put on our
Stand
item
short.
12 hats.
with Division of Water Rights. And on my left is Les Grober. On my right is Mariana Awi and David Rose.
Great,
from
and is
OCC.
there, can someone print out what you're going to propose so we actually can look at it too?
We can print it out as well, but it will be up on the screen for everyone, but we'll do that.
Okay.
Yeah, we provided some change sheets in the back, some copies of the change sheets for day 2. We'll go around
As-
and grab them and bring
I've been
them to you.
watching The Voice.
And there's one edit on the change sheet where we have the wrong number, just so everybody is aware, and we'll be making that update. So, do you want to wait till you get the hard copies, or do you want me to go?
Dan, can I just ask a clarification? The change sheets in the back, do they include everything that's going to be presented on the slides here?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Specifically today, we'll be focusing on the change sheet for day 2. There was a change sheet that was circulated yesterday that had other changes, and these are ones that are brand new. So for some people, they may be stapled together, I don't know, but day 2 is exactly what we'll be focusing on.
Okay, so we'll start with the proposed changes to the resolution. We have 2 main changes that we had here. First was not to refer to the extirpation of species in item 5 in the resolution, and also to add additional rationale for the emergency regulation and explain that it is that not the preferred method to identify, balance, and implement in-stream flow requirements. Oops. So on page 2 of the proposed resolution, the proposed change would be to change the third sentence in whereas paragraph number 5 as follows: to the National Marine Fisheries Service has identified minimum flows in mill, deer, and antelope creeks below which significant harm to the species would occur, and that would remove necessary to prevent extirpation of these species. The second proposed change is on page 4 of the resolution, and it would add whereas paragraph 16 to read, as discussed above, the State Water Board is adopting emergency regulations because of the emergency drought conditions the need for prompt action, and the unique attributes of these three tributaries. The vehicle of adopting emergency regulations to identify a minimum flow requirement for fisheries protection and health and safety requirements is an appropriate approach in these limited circumstances, but this approach is not the board's preferred alternative to identify, balance, and implement in-stream flow requirements. The board reaffirms its preference for undertaking adjudicative water right proceedings to assign responsibility for meeting in-stream flows. Then we had some proposed changes to the regulation that we wanted to go over. One was to add certainty to suspending curtailment when flows are no longer needed. And then we also had some proposed changes in the local cooperative solutions sections to modify the existing language to accommodate agreements that water right holders enter into with National Marine Fisheries Service and California Department of Fish and Wildlife, so that water right holders have greater certainty. And also to modify language for other local cooperative solutions. So on page 3 of the proposed regulation, this edit would occur in 3 places. It would occur on page 3 in section 877C1E. It would also occur on page 5 in section 877C2E, and on page 6 in 877C3E. It's the same edit in all 3 of those sections. And here we would change the second sentence to read that the deputy director shall within 5 days suspend curtailment orders that are based on the need for a particular flow volume when presence of adult or juvenile spring run salmon and Central Valley steelhead or hydrologic conditions no longer support the need for the required flows.
When you say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just so I understand, when that means presence or lack of presence, or it could mean that they're present somewhere else where you don't need it? That's what it means?
Yeah, that's meaning presence or lack of presence.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
It's both, that either they're not there or they are there and the conditions are no longer conducive to trying to maintain the run.
Yeah.
On page 7 of the proposed regulation, the proposed change is the first and second sentence of section 878B, and we would change that to read, other direct diversions solely for non-consumptive uses if those diverters file with the deputy director a certification under penalty of perjury that the diversion is non-consumptive as to not decrease downstream flows in the applicable watershed. The certification must describe the non-consumptive use and explain with supporting evidence why the diversions and use did not decrease downstream flows in the applicable watershed. And that was to address OCID's concerns about water transfers. On page 11 and 12 of the proposed regulation in section 878.2 with the local cooperative solutions, we have the largest change as a whole that we made. I can read through it real quick here. If the National Marine Fisheries Service and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife enter into an agreement with a diverter or diverters that the service or department determines provides watershed-wide protection for the fishery that is comparable to or greater than that provided by this regulation, the diverter or diverters may request approval from the deputy director to implement the agreement in place of state board issue curtailment orders under this article. The deputy director shall approve the request so long as the other users of water will not be injured. The deputy director's approval may be subject to any conditions, including reporting requirements that the deputy director determines to be appropriate. If the deputy director does not act on a request within 1 week of receipt, the request will be deemed approved. And I would like to call out, because it's kind of all in track changes, some of this was just moved around, but one of the key pieces that we did add here was if the deputy director does not act to a request within 1 week of receipt, it would be deemed approved, to add some clarification to that.
Sorry, let me make one edit. The PowerPoint shows, this is non-substantive, but just so that the language you have is the same as what's on the change sheet. The PowerPoint, can you go back one slide, please?
Yes.
The PowerPoint on the, sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th line says that's comparable to or greater than that provided by this regulation. On the change sheet, we use this article just for OAL consistency type language. So the change sheet is right. The PowerPoint uses regulation, but just so you know, the language that will be proposed has this article like is used later in the same paragraph.
Additionally, in the section down below that, this is just continuing on in the section on this slide. We added other local cooperative solutions may also be proposed to the Deputy Director. And then at the end of this section, the Deputy Director may approve a request or approve it subject to any conditions, including reporting requirements that the Deputy Director determines to be appropriate. If the Deputy Director determines the continued diversion is reasonable, other users of water will not be injured, and that the relevant minimum flows identified in this article will be met.
So I thought I understand that, but I'm not entirely sure. So that just means not just the cooperative agreements with nymphs and Fish and Wildlife. If someone has another cooperative agreement that the Deputy Director says that's fine too, that gives the Deputy Director the ability to say, okay.
Yeah, so exactly. So what we've done here is we're distinguishing between two different types of cooperative solutions.
agreement.
One that involved the fishery agencies, which was much of the subject yesterday, and we made that simpler, if you will, and address some of the concerns that were raised yesterday in terms of not second-guessing that, whereas here we still have some of the determinations of the Deputy Director for solutions, local agreements that don't involve the NIMS or CDFW.
And then this last slide just shows where the text was removed. And like I said, some of it was moved up to the top of the paragraph. And in the last piece there, such was stricken.
One point I want to direct your attention to, because this was responsive to some of the comments that we heard yesterday, is we added, sorry, Dan, could you go back one slide, please? One more, you have the link. Yeah, okay. The second paragraph on the screen, Deputy Director's approval may be subject to any condition. The sentence after that, if the Deputy Director does not act on a request within 1 week of receipt, the request will be deemed approved. That's new language to address the concern we heard yesterday about
being dangling.
how quickly this will happen, how quickly these local cooperative solutions will be dealt with. That language currently is only applied to local cooperative solutions that include the fisheries agencies based on how this is laid out. But that was something that we wanted to highlight because it was raised yesterday.
And those were all the changes proposed.
And where do we stand with the fisheries agencies coming back?
I have preliminary indications that 2 o'clock should be possible for at least Howard Brown. I'm not sure who else in the team can be assembled, but we'll certainly have Howard Brown here at 2 o'clock.
Okay, good.
And then additionally, I had staff put together some unimpaired flow numbers to address board member Diadamo's comments yesterday about wanting to kind of look at what these flow numbers are based on the unimpaired flow. We could go over that now or wait until 2 o'clock if you'd like to see those slides.
Defer to you guys. What your
Yeah, I was interested in that, just for that type of context.
Would you like
Yes.
to see those now?
I'm interested in seeing that.
Can we pull up the unimpaired flow?
I haven't gotten a response from Alicia, so I'm a little nervous.
So this slide here just shows what the current flow is as of a couple days ago in Deer and Mill Creek. We currently do not have a gauge in Antelope Creek. So the gauges that are used here are the upstream gauge that we would be using to reference as basically unimpaired flow coming into the lower reach where the major diversions are. So at this point, as you can see, it was about 40% and 37% on Deer Creek, and 27% and 28% is what the 50 cubic feet per second would represent now as unimpaired flow in those tributaries.
And of course, that's going to increase pretty quickly, right, as the falling limb, the hydrograph.
Correct. So I also had staff pull together a comparison with the flows in 1977, where we have basically unimpaired flow data upstream of diversions in Deer Mill and Antelope Creek to get a better comparison. We did it for June, for the upcoming month when the regulation would mainly impact these flows. And we did weekly averages to kind of make it a little simpler to look at. So in the top left there, it looks like we go left to right as we go across the stream. The first week of June in Deer Creek, if we were to do the 50 cubic feet per second in 1977, it would be 61% of the unimpaired flow, 43% in Mill, and it would represent 97% in Antelope. In the second week of June, it would represent, and I should back up for 1 second. We also did the 20 cubic feet per second next to the 50 cubic feet per second to show kind of the difference if the juvenile flows were in place and the adult flows were not. So for the juvenile flows for that first week, it would be 25% in Deer, 17.5% in Mill, and 55% in Antelope. Second week of June, it would be 61% starting with the 50 CFS, 61% in Deer, 46% in Mill, and 97% in Antelope. The 20 cubic feet per second is 25%, 18.5%, and 55% in Antelope. The third week of June, and this is where, likely under most projections, we would certainly expect the adult migration to be over. But we'll continue with both. The 50 cubic feet per second would be 66% in Deer, 51% in Mill. And at this point, there was no longer 35 cubic feet per second coming into the Antelope section. For the 20 cubic feet per second, 26.5% for Deer, 20.5% for Mill, and 62% for Antelope. Over in looks like pretty much the last week of June, we have 73% for Deer for the 50 cubic feet per second, 60 for Mill, and again greater than 100% for Antelope, as that flow did not exist. It was at 29. For the 20 cubic feet per second, it would be 29% for Deer, 24% for Mill, and 68% for Antelope. And then you can see the last 2 days of the month are just down there at the bottom. I also had staff quickly just kind of pull together some comparisons between 1977 and 2014 flow data for this month, this May. And so we can kind of get an idea of how we are tracking compared to 1977. We are tracking higher in Deer and Mill. Again, we don't have an active gauge in Antelope, but you can see that in Deer Creek, we're about roughly just under 30 CFS cubic feet per second higher, and in almost all weeks. And in Mill Creek, it's a little bit higher, closer to 50 plus cubic feet per second in the system at this time. So I hope that provides you some more background and insight into what the flows would look like.
I really appreciate that. This is very helpful. Thank you. So the only other question that I would have, and it gets to be a little confusing looking at each of the streams and the time frames. I know that there are other time frames, but did you just choose these time frames because they're the most impactful?
Yeah, with the short time period, and most of the discussion yesterday was regarding the June flows more than the October flows. So I thought we'd just focus on the June flows, with the assumption that if the regulation was adopted and went through OAL, it would start in the beginning of June.
Thank you.
Other questions? I have a bunch of questions, but I'm not sure when the best time to ask them are. Let me try one, which is, can you, again, we have the materials, but I'm trying to figure out how to frame the question to make it shorter. So as you look at these, if you look at these numbers which are higher, and this I may just not be remembering since yesterday, the time for action could be now or it could be in the next couple of weeks. And then the second issue is you've set these up as sort of base flows with a number of caveats for adjustment based on when the fish are here. Is the when the fish are here part only a part of cooperative agreements, or is it also a part of the regulation?
That is a part of the regulation.
Okay. And explain to me how it works again.
The idea behind that piece of the regulation is that we recognize that we will need to manage these systems in real time.
Right.
We don't want to set just a set period of time and require the flows through that period of time if the fish aren't present or those flows are not going to benefit the fish.
Right.
So the way we crafted the regulation was to either based on information that we are receiving or recommendations from the fish agencies, we could make a determination that the curtailment should be lifted essentially if it's spring or instigated in fall.
In spring or fall, but in real time it might be in a given week.
Right.
And so, and we have the ability, so you're asking us for the ability to be able to impose curtailments based on this number, and we'll talk about the number later this afternoon. I'm just talking about the mechanism, which is giving the deputy director the ability to implement it based on the presence of fish in consultation with the fish agencies?
Yes.
Is that how it works? And so as a result, if you look at the chart and numbers, and you might adapt the chart you did for 77 for these, better numbers, then those percentages that you showed, which was very, very useful to see, aren't necessarily likely to be the kind of water redirection that we would actually see unless you had a bunch of fish there the whole month or the full week, right? I didn't say that very well, but I'm trying to help illuminate for the people who are going to be affected by this what it might mean and how you've tried to craft the regulation to do the minimal amount responsibly necessary to help some fish in some circumstances during a dire period for all.
Yes.
So the mechanism is what I want you to explain a little bit better. I didn't get it as much through the reading of the, I know you had it in your heads and you explained it yesterday, but I want it explained again, and I probably want the language augmented to make quite clear that we're not talking about the backstop being totally in place unless there's a cooperative agreement. There's also some judgment and exercise of trying to only use this water when it's really needed, even within the regulation itself.
That's actually one of the items that we covered this morning, that item E, where we talk about suspending curtailments. So if we get information from the fish agencies that there's no fish in the system, that there's no need for these flows, then now we even have it rather than a may, that the deputy director shall within 5 days suspend
Right, and
curtailment.
hopefully
So-
sooner, right?
And hopefully sooner, but again,
Right.
there's just not to make it like instantaneous. We will operate in real time based on information, but it's not like this will languish. Now we have the regulation that a curtailment goes in and just stays in for no reason, so that if their conditions are not such that we need the curtailment, it turns off.
But it's also, and the same is true in the turn on.
That's correct.
We didn't modify the language for the turning on. That's in F of each
Right.
creek-specific area because that wasn't implicated to the same way from the comments yesterday, but that already has built into it the consultation with the fish agencies as to when the curtailment period begins.
Right.
And in each section, creek-specific section, for each date range, it says if adult CCV steelhead or if juvenile are
Right.
present. And so we do have paragraphs E and F for
Right.
each creek to more explicitly address how that will be determined so that the deputy director can operate nimbly based on the best available information about the fish presence and not just the calendar ticks over to another date, these flows are required. That's in there with all of the caveats to make that not happen in many situations. So
Right.
nimbleness was definitely something we strive for, to not have it in place unless it was necessary.
Right. I just think we need to be clear in whatever narrative we put out with this, exactly what it is and what it isn't, because in the absence of clarity, people assume the negative, and understandably so. Okay. Great. I'm going to hand the chair to the vice chair, and I will be back. And I promise never to say yes to doing anything on a Wednesday or a Tuesday ever again.
You heard her. So, are there any additional questions on item 12? No. Okay, now we are going to move back to item 13. And we are going to start with the public comments, I believe. 13. We're moving back to 13, correct?
Yeah, I'm just wondering when there was some talk of when we would be doing a lunch break if we wanted to. Okay, for 10 minutes, we're going to start for 10 minutes? Okay.
Mr. O'Laughlin. How could I not turn on my mic for Mr. O'Laughlin?
Me too.
And we are on item 13.
Thank you.
I know.
Can we have the first slide from the state staff's presentation put back up on the screen? The reasons for the curtailment.
Okay.
Great, thank you very much. Tim O'Laughlin, I'm here today representing Oakdale Irrigation District. I think these points are important for why you're looking for curtailment in the watershed, and I'm going to tie them back to the San Joaquin River system. So real quickly, if you look at these items, you've already adopted under your TUCP for the Bureau that the Bureau will be operating pursuant to Table 2E flow releases on New Maloney's. And you relieve them of the obligation to meet the D1641 flow requirements at Vernalis. So with that in play, there should be absolutely no impact to a CVP facility in the San Joaquin River system that would be shorted by providing water to meet a delta flow requirement, okay? So those issues aren't even applicable to what we're doing. The other issue is Friant's out of the mix, so that CVP facility is not in play. So you've taken that one off the table too with the TUCP and the exchange contractors. So when you look at it with the TUCP in place and FERC releases from the Tuolumne at 100 and FERC releases from the Merced at 50, we're going to have about 300 CFS showing up at Vernalis starting in June. So the reason we sent you the letter was that given accretions or depletions, if you're going to try to push water back up into Shasta or Orville or those other facilities based on 300 CFS of releases at the 3 tribs, you're not going to get there. Because between depletions and other uses in the system, the water will be gone. So in reality, from a legal perspective, I'll leave other people to argue the law, but from a practical effect, I don't see how that's going to work. On post 14s, you're already too late. We've talked to your staff about this numerous times, and Mr. O'Hagan's here, and if I misspeak, he can come up and correct me. Post-14 curtailments, as pointed out by Mr. Moore, on the San Joaquin River side of the system should have probably been issued about a month ago. So you're too late there, and no one's diverting pursuant to post-14 rights right now anyway, because there's not enough inflow into the system. So the San Joaquin's going to get very strange quickly, depending on how you go about doing these curtailment notices. On or about July 1st, based on the TUCP and what you adopted, you understood when those documents were in front of you that there would be less than 5,000 acre feet of inflow at 5,000 on the Stan, 5,000 on the Merced, and I think it's 7,000 on the Tuolumne. So there would be a total of 17,000 acre feet total for the entire month of July. So at that point in time, you're either going to have to cut off riparians or bypass flow. But what we've pointed out in our papers is we're already releasing stored water at the reservoirs. So you don't get any help there. And then finally, and we've had numerous discussions with your staff, and actually it's nice to hear Paul mention this today, Fujitama. If you're looking at the depletions right now in the system, with New Maloney's releasing, I think Paul said 2,100 CFS, 2,200 CFS was showing up at Vernalis, okay? When they go on June 1st, they're going to go to 150 CFS at release. And your requirement, based on the TUCP, is not protected at Vernalis. The requirement was a release from Goodwin. So in that sense, there is no, unlike the Sacramento system where you release water at Shasta and all these people may take water in between where you're trying to get it to Delta outflow. In this situation, when you set up the TUCP, you set the release and compliance for point at Goodwin, it's being met, and there's no diverter between that and the Bureau. So there's no way you can try to push more water up into that. Then finally, it's just a statement, but there is no way that senior water right holders are going to share the pain, do equitable sharing, or any of that other stuff. The water right priority system has to be met. And if the projects fall short at storage, they have a simple solution. They can either cut their contractors, the settlement contractors, the exchange contractors. They can come back here and seek a TUCP again and change the requirement. But senior water right holders are not going to release senior water to meet Delta outflows or fishery requirements that are the obligations of the projects. That's just off the table. Thank you for your time.
I have a question. 17,000 acre feet total. You said we understood. I guess you must mean Mr. Howard must have understood when he approved the temporary urgency change petition.
Yes, those numbers were given to you and they were in the temporary urgency change petition. Those numbers were from DWR. And what you have to understand, put this in context. That's 17,000 acres for the entire Stanislaus, Tuolumne, Merced, and main stem San Joaquin. That's over 500,000 acres with 17,000 acre feet of water. Okay, so the reason we sent you the letter was to try to explain there is no water to deal with in the San Joaquin system. We realize there's going to be pain. We've come up with these operation schedules. We're going to try to make them work. But if you start putting other obligations on us for fish and wildlife purposes or Delta outflow purposes, we're not going there. We just can't. Our rights won't allow us to do it. We're not going to do it, and we've already come up with our operation plans for the year, and we can't change them. We're already in deficit. And so, as I said yesterday, this is a really clear point for you and the board members. If you want to push the envelope, and I don't know where you want to go with this, if you want to push the envelope and say, we're going to come up with public trust flows in the summertime from June or whenever you adopt these curtailments onward, okay, and push that issue out there and call it an emergency rig, I understand that. And then we will say no, and then we'll just go to court and see who's right about it. Thank you.
Okay, well, wait. Getting back to the 17,000 acre feet. So, and maybe we should have the Bureau and the department up here as well. But did that assume curtailments?
No, that is and what they put in their document was that the full natural flow at 90% come July was going to be approximately 17,000 acre feet. So that is the projection. We have been tracking, and I'm glad you pointed out, I love Mr. O'Hagan's tracking on the individual systems. If you look on the individual systems, the Merced and the Stanislaus are below the 90%. We're worse than 90%. The Tuolumne is just a little bit better than 90%. So we're tracking even worse than the numbers that they had. What I'm trying to explain is that, you know, in discussions with Mr. O'Hagan and company, post-14 curtailment should have been issued about a month ago. So you're not, that's Katie bar the door, that's gone. And then come around July 1, you're not going to have any natural flow in the system for riparians, or very little. 17,000 acre feet spread out over that entire area. So that's why, and I'm going to, Mr. Herrick's here and he can speak for his clients who have riparian rights mainly in the Delta. That's why we understood when we wrote the letter, we knew these situations were coming. And so in the total aggregate of A, trying to push water back up into Shasta and Oroville, 300 CFS isn't going to make a difference, okay, in the overall context. And two, I mean, that assumes 100% of that water would actually get pushed back up. And the second part is that we all understood the pain and realized that given the operations that were in place, that's the water that would be available. So we're not asking you to curtail riparians come July 1st. If water is in the Delta and they're taking it in the South Delta, we're fine with it, as long as they're not calling on senior projects upstream to release water. So that's what the quid pro quo kind of was on how we came up with that agreement. It's the same thing with the Jeannie Salezi's here for her downstream clients on the west side of the San Joaquin system. So we really, this is kind of a weird deal for them. If we release water, stored water, riparians aren't entitled to it. But as downstream pre-14 water right holders, the west side guys would be entitled to pick that water up. So a weird scenario would be you cut off pre-14s, let's say June 15th, but then come July 1, when only stored water is being released and there is no riparian flow and there's no question about it, our statement would be is the west side guys get to pick that up. So if you're looking at the time periods and the amount of water, when we got together and talked about this, it made no sense to curtail anybody at any time because all you're doing is switching water from one period to the other with no net effect, out the door, at the lower San Joaquin.
But if we do curtail, your preference is which option?
The only curtailment that I believe you should do is a curtailment that you currently have pursuant to your executive director, I think, in your previous rules and regs, can issue curtailment notices at any time, issue them. I mean, and there's no need for rules or regulations. And on our side of the aisle, I don't think, based on the senior water right holders and the majority of the people that signed that letter, basically from Friant downstream to the South Delta, you're not going to hear a water right complaint. But in going, Tom and I talked about this, and we talked about this yesterday, if you're going to include some element of unreasonable impact on fish and wildlife, so if you want to say that the San Joaquin River has to have 300 CFS minimum flows at all times at various locations, then we can't do it. Then it's just going to be a water right war. Thank you.
Thank you. We will take a break now till 12:30, and the first person up is John Herrick. Well, but we got Herrick.